I saw it this morning and I was like, oh, how nice would it be to not get out of bed?
To hear it. I've got 7:45 class. I have to get up at 5:30. I don't want to hear it.
I got up at 4:20 for practice.
Yeah, see, you don't want to hear it either.
I had to sleep on the couch last night because I washed my wife in Fort Wayne and I washed the top for her bed and I didn't dry it by myself.
Amanda's beeping. Amanda's beeping.
What was that? Don't worry about it. I was trying to tell them about yourself. That's so weird. But the next day, everything they know. Yeah. Old school type too.
All right. It's time to begin. So, did you guys remember to bring your handout? There. All right. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you that our people on quarantine are now, well, at least we're away, are now back. Thank you, Amanda's feeling better. We pray she has a very beautiful, robust immune response to the Pfizer vaccine, that this renders her protected from SARS-CoV-2. We thank you, Dane's back. We pray for his team that people would continue to test negative, and we thank you for this time. We pray now we'd use it wisely. In Jesus' name, amen. Do you guys have any questions either about elongation or desaturation? That's where we ended. We covered those two topics rather quickly. You might have some questions about them. Do you? Or
If I remember, are they both in the
yes, they both occur in the ER. The elongation can take place also in the outer membrane of the mitochondria. But both these processes predominantly occur in the smooth ER. So elongation, again, your donator is still malonyl coenzyme A. These essentially, these elongases are specialized for fatty acids of different lengths. And then your reductase doesn't really matter what the substrate is, because the reductase is just dealing with this end. So it's converting the 3-keto or the beta-keto acyl into the 3-hydroxy acyl. It uses NADPH, that's CAR, that encodes the beta-keto adductyl or 3-keto acyl CoA reductase. And then the 3-hydroxyacyl dehydratase will take the beta-hydroxy acyl or 3-hydroxyacyl coenzyme A. It'll dehydrate it, takes this and that, makes the enoyl, trans enoyl, 2,3-enoyl coenzyme A. You then reduce that. This must be trans. If that's not trans, this enzyme can't work. So then the trans 2,3-enoyl coenzyme A reductase once again uses NADPH, and now you have your fatty acyl coenzyme A. It's 2 carbons longer. 2 carbons longer. The desaturase uses the desaturase enzyme, it catalyzes this reaction here. It takes molecular oxygen. It takes 2 of the carbons from the fatty acid and gives those to molecular oxygen to make water. So you have these protons that have to come in, and then you need electrons for those carbons. Those electrons come from the iron, or the cytochrome B. You've oxidized the iron. You go from iron 2 to iron 3. Ferrous to ferric. You now have to reoxidize that. Sorry, reduce it. To do that, you use the cytochrome B5 reductase. That will take the iron 3, reduce it back to iron 2. This has a flavine that lets you do that. Then to reload the flavine for that again, you're going to use NADH, and this all occurs in the smooth ER. And the desaturase can handle lots of different lengths fatty acids, but there's different desaturases that tend to specialize for different fatty acids. And as we said, the mammalian desaturase can only work from carbon 1 to 9, can't work past that. Only plants do that. Therefore, we have essential fatty acids we have to get in our diet. In particular, linoleic acid and linolenic acid. There. So remember, the main product is palmitate. That's C16. You elongate palmitate to stearate. You can occasionally make stearate with the fatty acid synthase complex. The main product by far is palmitate. You'll elongate that to stearate. You can then desaturate it to oleate. That's as much desaturation as the animal system can do. In plants, you can further desaturate that to make linoleate. And linoleate has a double bond at 9 and 12. You then put another one at 15, you have linolenate, alpha linolenate. That's 9, 12, 15. Only plants can do that. These are 2 essential fatty acids in our diets. Yeah.
Sorry, never ending question. Where did the names of those come from?
I'm not altogether sure. I'm not altogether sure.
I like the arachidonate. I wasn't sure if they like found it in a specific thing that had it.
Yeah, that sounds a bit like arachnid. And it was not isolated in spiders, but the story goes, I think when it was isolated, the crystals that it made looked like spider webs. So they called it arachidonate, which is kind of a cool name actually for a fatty acid. So notice with humans, when they get a hold of linolenate, they can then put a double bond further towards the front, which they can do. You have 6, 9, 12, and then you elongate that. Now 6, 9, 12 becomes 8, 11, 14, and then you desaturate one more, you now have 5, 8, 11, 14. That's arachidonate. Arachidonate is essential for the synthesis of prostaglandins. Without the synthesis of prostaglandins, the immune response is somewhat hamstrung. And then in plants, you can make a variety of other polyunsaturated fatty acids that are used for lots of different things. This is pretty much where we go with your animal fatty acids. That is one of the longer ones. We have a few others that are a tad longer. They're rare. This one is pretty common in the membrane. The desaturases can also handle fatty acids that are already esterified to glycerol. So here you can see we have a C18, and that C18 is going to get a double bond. This desaturation can put it there. That makes linoleate. And then you put another one in, that makes linolenate, while it's attached to the fatty acid. Well, it's attached to the glycerol. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. And this is important because, as we'll see, when you link fatty acids to glycerol to make lipids, that happens in membrane. So those are already in the membrane. They can encounter the desaturase. That's precisely what happens. And as we said, linoleate and linolenate are referred to as essential fatty acids. We must just get those in our diet. It's pretty easy to get those in your diet if you eat balanced diet. So they're found in several different types of oils. Olive oil, they're found in sunflower oil, they're found in most of your salad dressings will have it, most of your vegetables will have it. Very common. Fish oil is very rich in that as well. The cardiovascular benefits of fish oil have been debated because some very large studies fail to show any benefit. However, fish oil does seem to have other benefits. Fatty acids seem to have an immunosuppressive effect. It's not a big one, but it's a small one. Also, there's a pretty clear benefit for fatty acids to your eyes because your photoreceptor cells take a beating from oxidative damage, light-based oxidative damage. Fish oils can help the body repair that damage. And I started taking fish oil on my own just for the cardiovascular benefits, but then my ophthalmologist told me to stay on it because of my, well, in my case, my eye. In your case, your eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, there aren't any questions, and we'll move to the synthesis of this grand group of fatty acid derivatives called eicosanoids.
How do you pronounce it again?
Eicosanoids, or eicosanoids, as some say. You say eicosanoid, I say eicosanoid. Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. Let's call the whole thing off. You guys are way too young to know that song. So arachidonic acid is the precursor for the synthesis of prostaglandins. And arachidonic acid is converted to this molecule. This is prostaglandin H2, prostaglandin H2. Prostaglandin G is a biosynthetic intermediate. This is never released in the body. You could see that is not going to be very stable, excuse me. And this, therefore, is an intermediate, and the reaction is a two-step reaction that goes from arachidonate to prostaglandin G2, then prostaglandin H2. Prostaglandin H2 is then the branch point between the synthesis of thromboxanes and prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are short distance signalers. They're very powerful signalers, but they're short distance. They don't have very long half-lives, but they are produced rather constantly in damaged tissue. So this enzyme is called COX, or cyclooxygenase. You can see it uses, excuse me, molecular oxygen, and it is inhibited by a whole group of drugs called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. which are conveniently abbreviated NSAIDs or NSAIDs, or however you like to say it. NSAIDs. So NSAIDs include aspirin. Aspirin is unusual amongst the NSAIDs. We'll see why in just a bit. Aspirin is a so-called salicylate. So there's the salicylates, and then there are the non-salicylates. And the non-salicylates are all non-competitive inhibitors. Competitive inhibitors of COX. Salicylates are also competitive inhibitors. But aspirin is a suicide inhibitor of COX. Let's say permanent and we'll see why here in just a bit. All right, so how's arachidonic acid made? Go ahead and see if you can draw how arachidonic acid is made. We talked about it, see if you can remember it. Go ahead, try and draw it out. So start with the palmitate. So can we agree on the first step? Okay, elongation. Good. That'll give you okay, then what happens? Where? 9, okay. And for animals, it's going to end there, but we're going to get this from plants. So then in plants, Another desaturation. That gives us a 12. Okay, and okay, so another desaturation. And that's linolenate. All right. Then what happens?
Sorry, not elongation.
Elongation, okay. So now you have a 20. So these essentially add 2, right? Okay. Very good. All right. And then another desaturation. To arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid, there it is. Yeah. All right. Good. Once you get to linolenic acid, the pathway gets pretty clear. You have desaturation, the elongation, another desaturation, and you're pretty much there. There you go. Good job. Okay. All right, so that's essentially your pathway. And yeah. Okay, here is the structure of cyclooxygenase. You can see it's embedded in the membrane. You can also see it's a paired enzyme. It's a dimer. And it's not terribly clear, but you should be able to see a substrate that is in there. That substrate is arachidonic acid. And there's a piece sticking over here. And it's a little clearer over here. Yes, it is. Yeah. Also, something that should be clear, that's a little very hard to see. You can't see it. There's a red ball right there. There's an iron. There's an iron cofactor. That iron cofactor is really important. And then there is another piece that's really quite important. Okay, we got the iron. Yeah, we got the iron. And then this thing in blue right here, that's tyrosine. That's going to be really important in the mechanism. Really important in the mechanism. All right, this is complicated, so feel through this with me. So here is your arachidonate. So the iron goes from iron 3 to iron 4. Yikes. Iron 3 to iron 4. Then our tyrosine 385, that tyrosine is absolutely conserved in COX enzymes. It is going to give to the iron. The iron is going to bind a singlet oxygen. It will give an electron. That singlet oxygen will now not be a singlet anymore. And then here's your arachidonate and your molecular oxygen. You're now going to make a doublet. You're going to bind the arachidonate to the oxygen. The tyrosine is no longer a tyrosinyl radical. The tyrosinyl radical is going to reform as you give another electron here, make prostaglandin G, and then you resolve that to prostaglandin H. This is a different site in the enzyme called the peroxidase site. It's very close by the cyclooxygenase site. The iron and that tyrosine are the business end of the enzyme. So here's the tyrosine. The tyrosine, as you can see, is going to abstract this hydrogen right here. So this is, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13. It's the hydrogen from C13. When you do that, you make a double bond. As you can see here, the tyrosine radical that you formed here is now no longer present. Now your oxygen comes in. Your oxygen is going to attack right here and also right here. Right here and right here. Because you're withdrawing electrons from here, you're going to get this double bond attacking over here, and you're going to make that cyclized ring, and the oxygens are going to bind to each other and form this little bridge that sits above your cyclopentane ring there, cyclopentenyl ring. That's your prostaglandin G2. This then needs to get resolved. Resolution of this is going to convert this from G2 to the prostaglandin H, to the prostaglandin H. And that's essentially and the donator is usually glutathione. Glutathione. And there is prostaglandin H. You can see the difference between these two is the resolution of that pup right there. Glutathione will also regenerate that tyrosine radical that was on the cyclooxygenase. So as we said, cyclooxygenase is the target of NSAIDs. Here's how aspirin does its dirty work. So aspirin is O-acetyl salicylate. O-acetyl salicylate. That salicylate, this hydroxyl group, the serine, that's actually in the active site, is going to be attacked by this carbonyl carbon. This carbonyl carbon is electron poor, so the electron greedy oxygen will attack this. That is a nucleophilic attack. It'll form an acetylated serine that permanently inactivates the COX. Salicylate, now, this is actually a competitive inhibitor also of COX. So even the COX that is not inactivated still is subject to inhibition. This is the reason why aspirin is given to patients with heart conditions, because platelets can't remake their COX. They get it inhibited, now the platelets won't stick together because they need cyclooxygenase to become activated. And it makes thromboxane A2, which is a platelet activator. You give them COX, other cells can remake their cyclooxygenase, platelets cannot. That's why the endothelial cells benefit if the platelets are inhibited. That's why you tip the teeter-totter towards endothelial health and anticoagulation.
So this kind of, I feel like it's kind of a question, but is aspirin different than, does it work differently than blood thinners then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So-called blood thinners come in two categories. There's antiplatelet drugs, and there's actually anticoagulation drugs. Antiplatelet drugs are used if you have a clotting problem in veins. No, arteries, sorry, arteries. Anticoagulants are used if you have clots in veins. Veins, the blood is lower pressure, tends to pool. When blood pools, the chances of it clotting goes up. Arteries are under higher pressure. Where you're going to have clots is usually areas of high turbulence, because those are areas where the endothelium is subject to the most damage. So when you think of coronary arteries, where do you have the most buildup of plaque? Where there's branches, because those are areas under the highest turbulence. Those are the areas also that will be most prone to form clots. That's why for arteries you use antiplatelets. Clopidogrel, trade name is Plavix. Agrinox, which is aspirin in combination with a drug with a long name, disulfiram, disopropyl. And that drug used to be called Persitine, but Persitine is not, it's not very effective. If you give it with aspirin, now it's very effective. Dipyridamole, that's the name of it. So dipyridamole now is used, and is a combination drug called Agrinox. And people with atrial fibrillation, Agrinox is a common drug that's used. It's well tolerated. Just the aspirin can chew up your GI tract. That's the issue. All right. All the other NSAIDs are just competitive inhibitors. They don't do this. That's why they don't have the same cardiovascular benefit that aspirin has. And here are two members of the NSAID group. These are both available over the counter, ibuprofen and naproxen. And of all the NSAIDs, clinical data has pretty clearly shown naproxen is the safest of the NSAIDs when it comes to your heart and when it comes to your GI tract. Naproxen also has a very long half-life. So if you take naproxen, it's usually good for a day. I think the trade name, well, it's available as a generic, and then it's Nuprin. That's the trade name of it. Then ibuprofen is available in all kinds of forms, Advil. Then the clinical strength Motrin, which is the 800 milligram, but that's in generic too, so it's cheap and it's, yeah. These two drugs are specific inhibitors of a specific form of cyclooxygenase. Cyclooxygenase actually comes in a form that's expressed everywhere. It's called COX-1. So this is a housekeeping enzyme. So some prostaglandins will help with, for example, in the GI tract. Prostaglandins help with mucus production. They help with bicarbonate production. They therefore protect the GI tract from acid, and they also increase blood flow through the GI tract. If you inhibit prostaglandins, now you increase the tendency of the stomach to experience peptic ulcer disease. So also in the kidney, COX-1 will help the kidneys to have greater blood flow through them. If you load up on COX-1 inhibitors, you'll tend to cause renal ischemia over a period of time. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong, the occasional ibuprofen for a headache, for a weightlifting injury, for whatever, is fine. Those drugs are fine. It's if you take them chronically for long periods of time, then you can have an issue. So the drug, the enzyme that is induced when tissues are damaged is COX-2. And these specifically inhibit COX-2. So rofecoxib, marketed as Vioxx, was taken off the market because, at least in people with heart valve issues, it did increase the risk of heart attacks. Celecoxib, because of a very robust black box warning has avoided the lawsuits and the prohibitions that you had against rofecoxib. If you look at the old inserts of rofecoxib, there was a black box warning, and they still got sued. Over 90 million prescriptions were written for Vioxx. Guess how many heart conditions there were that were caused by Vioxx? Just over 100. Out of 93 million prescriptions. You do the math and tell me the percentage of that. Yet Merck still got sued. Yeah, great. So this is a drug that is available as a COX-2 inhibitor.
What does COX-2 do again?
It's the one that is induced when you have tissue damage. So this one is inducible. And this drug is used mainly for arthritis pain. Yeah, because rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis are associated with inflammation. Rheumatoid arthritis especially. So that drug is used predominantly for rheumatoid arthritis and severe forms of osteoarthritis as well. So from prostaglandin H2, you can then make the different prostaglandins or the thromboxanes. So here are the main prostaglandins. Prostaglandin I2, this is known as prostacyclin. And there's a prostacyclin synthase that will make prostacyclin. Then there is a prostaglandin endoperoxide reductase and a prostaglandin endoperoxide isomerase. And the reductase, as you can see, is going to take this oxygen bridge and reduce them to hydroxide groups, and that gives you prostaglandin F. This is quite important in the menstrual cycle. This is the one that is responsible for the regression of the corpus luteum during the menstrual cycle. And then isomerase, which, as you can see, is going to reduce this one, but not that one. That's prostaglandin E, which is really important in inflammation. Prostacyclin is a prostaglandin used by the GI tract and also by endothelial cells to promote endothelial health and to prevent clotting. And then thromboxane A2 synthase will make thromboxane A2. That's a progenitor of the thromboxanes. Thromboxanes are procoagulant molecules. And thromboxanes have a oxane ring, an oxane ring. That's called an oxane ring, hence the term thromboxane. They constrict blood vessels. They induce platelet aggregation. They're very important in blood clotting because they activate platelets. Arachidonate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of another group of signaling molecules called leukotrienes. Leukotrienes. Leuko, white, trienes, they have 3 double bonds, are important white blood cell signalers. That's why they're called leukotrienes. So the enzyme that initiates leukotriene synthesis is called lipoxygenase. Lipoxygenase. It converts arachidonate into a non cyclic molecule that is mercifully abbreviated HP, because hydroxy, peroxy, eicosanoate doesn't quite roll off the tongue. But the hydroxy, peroxy, eicosanoate is the precursor of your different leukotrienes. So here is 12 HP, here's 5 HP. 5 HP will then make leukotriene A4, C4, and D4. These are really, really important in asthma. And in fact, are you familiar with a drug called montelukast? Singular? Yeah, Singular prevents these from binding their receptor. Yeah, so montelukast is a leukotriene, particularly C4 leukotriene receptor antagonist. And then a drug called xyluton. Xyluton is an inhibitor of the lipooxygenase. It's not available in the US because it's linked to liver damage, but it's available overseas as a treatment for chronic asthma. And if that wasn't enough, plants also make eicosanoids, and they're important in plant defenses against insect insults, fungal infections. They're also important in pollen maturation and seed germination. One of them is called jasminate, and jasminate is a signaling molecule, and jasminate also initiates the synthesis of other eicosanoids that are important in plant defenses. This group of molecules are sometimes called phytoalexins. Phytoalexins. All right.
Is this what the material for the test is going to stop?
Yeah, it'll stop right here, essentially. Okay, dokie, artichoke. Okay. Now let's look at the synthesis of lipids from those fatty acids that you've made. So triacylglycerols are a very effective way to store energy. Think about it. They don't need to be hydrated because they're not water soluble. They stick together all on their own. They can double as a shock absorber for various parts of your body. They can also serve as an insulator to keep body heat in. Fat is an excellent insulator. And that is one reason why Arctic animals will store layers and layers of fat underneath their fur as insulators. So I know fat gets a bad rap, particularly in our society, largely because Western society has too much of it, but fat, don't knock it, because metabolically, fat's a great energy source and it can serve other features as well. So your body can only store enough glycogen to supply your needs for 12 hours. Fat can provide your energy needs for up to 12 weeks. The same amount of fat, you can get a lot more energy out of it. So that's very good storage material. So it is the most commonly used means of metabolic storage for most animals. Even insects store fat. When you dissect an insect, you see this white, greasy stuff, they're fat bodies. And those fat bodies turn out to be metabolically quite active. There's lots of interesting things those fat bodies do. And yeah, so
Is that why people go on calorie deficit? They like never ending source for their body.
yeah, that is the whole strategy behind the keto diet, is to force your body. Yeah, because your body essentially is now forced to use fat in that case. Your body's starving to death. Yeah, you're starving to death. That's essentially what's happening.
That's why it was classified as starvation for a long time. If you would look back 150 years ago, that causes death is starvation.
So the synthesis of triacylglycerols and the synthesis of your membrane glycerophospholipids start with the same precursors. So you start with fatty acyl coenzyme A's that come from the fatty acid synthase, and then L-glycerol 3-phosphate, and these are used to initiate the synthesis of your triacylglycerides and your membrane lipids. So glycerol 3-phosphate can be made in one of two ways. You can take glycerol. If you have eaten anything with fat in it, you'll have glycerol. From the hydrolysis of fats or cell membranes or something like that, there's an enzyme called glycerol kinase, very widespread, just takes ATP and gives you glycerol 3-phosphate. Easy. Alternatively, you have dihydroxyacetone phosphate that you get from glucose. That then can be converted to glycerol 3-phosphate by glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase that uses NADH to reduce this ketone to the alcohol, and now you have glycerol 3-phosphate. Two ways to get glycerol 3-phosphate. Yeah, yeah. And we're going to get to cholesterol after this. You can make a lot of cholesterol from it too, because cholesterol is made from acetylcoenzyme A, which you can get from fat or sugar. So when people stopped eating meat to lower their LDL, they started eating more sweet things, and LDL then really took off because they didn't understand you can make cholesterol from both means.
Yeah, like if you like fat free, doing everything.
Yeah.
All they did was add more sugar to make it taste good.
Yeah. All right. So from the glycerol 3-phosphate, you have enzymes called acyl transferases. These acyl transferases take the acyl coenzyme A and they will transfer it to the glycerol 3-phosphate. And they'll usually start here. They start here first usually. You start at the number 1 position, then you go to number 2, and now you have phosphatidic acid. Phosphatidic acid. There is a little bit of phosphatidic acid in membranes. Not very much, but a little. Phosphatidic acid is most commonly seen as an intermediate in your lipid synthesis. The phosphatidic acid is a branch point. So if you take this phosphate off, that's phosphatidic acid phosphatase, you make diacylglycerol. Diacylglycerol is then a substrate for the third acyltransferase, and now you've made triacylglycerol. That's a storage compound, not a structural compound. So if you take off this phosphate, you're going to make that. If you leave the phosphate on and put on a head group, now you're going to make a phospholipid. That's the branch point. So fat storage is regulated. I use the term here, profoundly regulated, because that's not too far from wrong, by these two hormones, glucagon and insulin.
Our friends back at it again.
Insulin is pro-fat storage. Glucagon is pro-fat degradation, anti-fat storage. Insulin is pro-fat storage, anti-fat degradation. So these two are mirror images of each other in what they do. So this is taken from your book, The Conversion of Glucose to Acetyl Coenzyme A, that's stimulated by insulin. The conversion of acetyl coenzyme A to fatty acids, that's stimulated by insulin. We saw this, insulin stimulates HCC, which converts acetyl coenzyme A to malonyl coenzyme A. That then leads to the synthesis of fatty acids. That's stimulated by insulin. The synthesis of ketone bodies, that is stimulated by glucagon. And these two procedures are shut down, consequently. So this process, ketogenesis, glucagon stimulated. And these are increased in diabetes, because in diabetes, you ain't got this, right? You ain't got this, glucagon levels soar, and now you get ketoacidosis.
Very not fun.
You heard it from the proverbial horse's mouth. And every diabetic I've talked to has said, no, not at all fun. No. Bill McMillan, who's in the corral, who's been a diabetic since he was 14, and is 87. Now, Bill is very stable. He's never had a blood sugar over 200. But Bill, when he was a young diabetic, did have some cases. He said when he became ketotic, he said, you feel as though you're circling the drain. That's how he put it. You feel like you're dying.
Yeah, and you can like, especially for me, I'll have very mild cases of ketoacidosis, which is just like, I just need to drink some water and take it easy for a few hours, and then I'm fine. But if it's really bad, it's like,
And you need to go to the hospital.
I've only ever been hospitalized for it once. Most of the time they have you treat ketoacidosis at home. If you're capable of drinking food.
Well, it's just washing them out is, But making sure that you don't lose so many electrolytes, you have arrhythmias.
If you're ketoacidosis, if you have ketoacidosis, you have to drink like tons of water and Gatorade.
Why do people drink that stuff? I just sickly sweet.
Yeah, I have
Good.
sick because when I'm sick, I tend to have ketoacidosis problems.
Most diabetics do. Yeah.
No, don't do the sugar-free stuff. Do grain sugar. And they're like, don't exercise if your blood sugar's high, and don't starve yourself if your blood sugar's high. It's gonna make you worse.
See, soccer where you sweat so much, I can kind of see it. But these guys in the weight room chugging Gatorade during the workout, why? Yeah, I just, well, sure, it's fast energy, so I can do more reps. I don't get it. I must be stupid. I don't get it. Okay. So the different types of phospholipids will depend upon the identity of the head group you put on them. The phospholipids will be named according to the head group. So head group attachment determines the various types of phospholipids. The substrate for sugar attachment was UDP, sugar. In lipids, it's CDP, lipid. This is your carrier for lipid. Notice once again, we're using a nucleotide to activate the molecule. So the two strategies, we'll see them both. One group of organisms will tend to use one, others will tend to use the other. You can activate the lipid and then use that to add the head group. With the head group, you have a oxygen. This oxygen with free electrons will attack the phosphate. You'll displace this CMP. That's a good leaving group, very stable. Lots of potential resonance stabilization, or you can use CDP to represent the head group. And then in this case, the diacylglycerol will attack this phosphate. You'll enter the head group and displace a cytosine monophosphate. Either way, you end up with a glycerol phospholipid. Either way, same thing. Our bodies are going to tend to use this strategy. Bacteria will tend to use these. And plants and fungi will tend to kind of share the wealth. So bacteria, E. coli, where this has been studied the most, they will use CDP diacylglycerol for the synthesis of their membrane lipids. And they make CDP diacylglycerol from phosphatidic acid and CTP by this enzyme that's kind of hard to read here, phosphatidate cytodilyl transferase. Phosphatidate cytodilyl transferase. Very heavily conserved enzyme in bacteria. The enzymes for phospholipid synthesis in bacteria, they're located on the inner leaf of the plasma membrane because they don't have an ER. In animal cells, that's the ER. So you make phosphatidic acid in E. coli from glycerol 3-phosphate and fatty acyl coenzyme and acyl transferases. You can use acyl ACP as a substrate as well with these acyl transferases. They can use acyl coenzyme A or acyl ACP. So you have a 3-phosphate glycerol, you have glycerol 3-phosphate, acyl transferase, that makes one acyl phosphate, one acyl glycerol 3-phosphate. The second is a different transferase, 1-acylglycerol 3 phosphate acyltransferase. That's going to make phosphatidic acid. And then the phosphatidic acid will be converted into the CDP diacylglycerol by the CTP and phosphatidate cytidine transferase. Phosphatidate cytidine transferase. Now, this is a substrate for two different synthases. First one is phosphatidylserine synthase. Phosphatidylserine synthase. This is already activated. You don't need to put any energy into this reaction. Then you have phosphatidylglycerol 3-phosphate synthase, PS synthase, PG synthase, PG 3-phosphate synthase. And the phosphatidylserine synthase will produce phosphatidylserine. And then that's the substrate for the phosphatidylserine decarboxylate. You decarboxylate it, it makes phosphatidylethanol. So phosphatidylethanol in the bacteria is made from phosphatidylserine. And this is from your book. We're out of time. We'll stop right here, and then we'll pick this up on Wednesday. Thursday, we're going to take our extracts that we know frataxin is there, and we're going to Western blot it. The Western blot will take, we'll have to run the gel, set up the Western blot, then you Western blot for several hours. So we'll set it up. So the hard part is making sure when you get that nylon on there, that all the bubbles are out. Bubbles inhibit electric transfer. You have to get it completely bubbleless. Bubbles are your enemy. And we'll do that then. Okay.